Welcome back to a new episode of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. As always, I'm your host, Anna Madlener, MRV Manager at the Carbon to Sea Initiative, and I'm joined by my co-host, Will Burns, who's the Co-Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Hi, Will.
Hi, Anna. Great to be back.
Yeah. Today, we're joined by Steve Oldham, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Captura, a company that's developing an approach for direct ocean capture. Captura focuses on using electrochemistry to capture CO2 directly from seawater and then reintroducing that decarbonized water to the ocean, where it will harness air-sea gas exchange to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Will, what are you excited about in this episode?
Well, it's been really interesting to observe the development of different marine-based carbon removal processes. And this is the second company we interview this season that's working on this approach called direct ocean capture. And it'll be interesting to see any distinctions that Captura draws between its approach and others. And also, this company has announced major pilot programs, so it'll be interesting to see the nature of those programs and what it portends for MCDR.
Yeah, wonderful. I have nothing to add to that except a lot, which we'll discuss in the episode.
Yeah.
So let's get started.
All right.
Welcome to the show, Steve. Hi.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. We'd love to first hear about your journey into the marine carbon removal world. What brought you to your work at Captura?
So I think I'm fairly unique. Captura is my second carbon removal company. I was the CEO at a direct air capture company called Carbon Engineering. And I was there for 4 and a bit years. And then I moved on to marine CDR with Captura. Carbon Engineering is one of the largest direct air capture companies. They're building a 500,000-ton facility in Texas. So I scaled that company from, I think it was about 15 people when I first joined, to over 150 today. And of course, my objective is to do the same with Captura, to bring a second solution to the carbon problem. The problem is so large, we need as many tools in the toolbox as we can get. So it's great to have this opportunity to work on a second really important carbon removal capability.
Cool. All right, great. Yeah, that's certainly one of the many challenges in the field. So before we dive into the details, can you give us a bit of an introduction into what Captura does and what approach to marine carbon dioxide removal it develops?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Captura was founded out of Caltech, the university in California. It was founded by 2 professors, and their philosophy was that the carbon removal problem is so large that we need a solution that is completely focused on large scale. You have to achieve 1 billion tons or it's not worth doing. So their concept was the largest carbon removal device on the planet is the ocean. It covers 70% of the surface of the planet. So is there a way in which we can harness that incredible carbon removal capacity, but do so in a way that doesn't harm the ocean? We're all very aware of the fact that the climate crisis has also affected the ocean very negatively. So can we do that without changing the fundamental characteristics of the ocean, without needing lots of land, lots of fresh water, lots of input materials, producing no waste products, and be efficient and sensible in our energy use? So that was the philosophy that created the company. And the solution that the company came up with is direct ocean capture. So we physically take CO2 out of the ocean water, and that frees up room, to put it simply, for the ocean to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere due to Henry's Law, which I know you have discussed in previous podcasts. Our process uses only ocean water and renewable electricity. We produce no waste products. We are compatible with intermittent and off-peak renewable energy. And the captured CO2 that we pull out of the ocean can be measured, and then it can be sequestered to produce carbon credits or used in products such as sustainable aviation fuels. The technology that underpins this is something called electrodialysis. which we can talk about in more detail. Captura raised $45 million in our Series A. I believe that to be the largest of any marine CDR company and probably in the top 5 of any carbon removal company at all. We're one of the 20 finalists for the Global Carbon Removal X Prize. We have a Frontier pre-purchase as well. Where we're up to, we are deep into extensive piloting an ocean health campaign right now, which I'm happy to talk to. And we've been operating at pilot scale for more than 2 years, a process that culminates with a 1 kiloton pilot that we'll be fielding in Kona in Hawaii in the first quarter of next year.
Awesome. I'm excited to dive into all the detail there. But before we do that, I want to pick up on one particular point, which is that we've kind of introduced the notion of both CDR, so carbon dioxide removal, as well as direct ocean capture. And for our listeners who are perhaps less averse in the field of carbon crediting, the carbon market, etc., the term capture traditionally refers to emission avoidance, right? So avoiding that a stream of CO2 is emitted from an industry, whereas I believe the approaches from direct air capture or direct ocean capture do seek to result in removal in the end. So can you tell us a little bit about how your company thinks about those two terms and why you choose the term direct ocean capture and how we should think about the crediting scheme there a bit as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually hit the nail on the head in your introductory comment there. Just like direct air capture, DAC, we physically collect CO2. You could say also that the point source capture industry also physically collects CO2. That CO2 is then either utilized, in which case you can say it's not removed, or, like, for example, it's made into a sustainable aviation fuel, or it can be sequestered and put permanently back underground. So we think that direct ocean capture correctly reflects the synergy between what we do and what direct air capture does. I'm aware of the fact that in the oceanography community, DOC stands for dissolved organic carbon. But without wanting to sound too facetious, we've briefed numerous stakeholders and policymakers. And when I go in and talk about DOC and DAC, they get that connection. I've never once heard a policymaker or a politician say, oh, I thought DOC stood for dissolved organic carbon. They get the connection between DAC and DOC. And a fundamental premise of what we're seeking to make clear with direct ocean capture is that our process is functionally identical to DAC. It uses an absorbent, in this case the ocean, and produces a stream of measurable CO2. So we think using DOC, direct ocean capture, its inherent synergies to DAC that is now fairly well understood in the policy environment is a better approach.
Mm-hmm. That is a really interesting point, that it's primarily a policy-informed decision. I do want to raise one flag, perhaps not a flag, but an additional complexity, which we can get to later in the conversation as well, is that unlike in direct air capture, there is still the ocean in between the actual removal, right? There is a different medium that does not immediately result in removal because you've captured the CO2 from the ocean. But we can perhaps get into that a bit later in the episode.
Of course. And yeah, I do have some thoughts on that, so I'll be happy to discuss.
So direct ocean capture comes with various technological approaches. Could you tell us how Captura's technology differs from others in the space that are denominated as direct ocean capture? For example, Banyu's sunlight-driven process, and we've talked about that process recently with Banyu on the show.
I don't know enough about the Banyu process to be able to accurately compare, but I can certainly talk about what our process does. We draw ocean water into the plant. We take about 0.5% of that out. We soften it to convert it into brine. Brine, of course, is pure salt water. That salt water goes into electrodialysis, which is a series of membranes powered by renewable electricity. And electrodialysis dissociates molecules and rearranges them. So salt water, sodium chloride, hydrogen, oxygen. In our electrodialysis process, we reform those into hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, an acid and a base. We take the acid and we put it into the 99.5% of the ocean water coming through the plant. That acidifies the stream, and we can then extract the CO2 as a gas, fully measurable. And then we put the base back in before the stream goes back into the wider ocean, creating that drawdown that I'm sure we'll talk about as we go along. So we believe our proprietary ED creates the lowest cost acid and base, and that our process will be able to scale both on and offshore. So that's a summary of our process and the way that it works.
Thanks. Drilling down on that a bit, can you explain to the audience how you draw water in to the facility, and what volumes of water are we talking about if we were looking at this, for example, at full scale deployment for a facility?
Yeah, so huge volumes of water. There's no getting away from that. CO2 in the atmosphere is about 420 parts per million today. You have to remove enormous amounts of air or touch large amounts of air to do any form of direct air capture. In the ocean, it's 150 times more volumetrically present. So you're moving 150 times less water. But of course, water is heavier. So we pump water through the system today. Our technology has been designed to work at very, very low pressure bars. So the volume, the push of water that we need through our system is extremely low. We actually anticipate that we will be able to use ocean currents at large scale, that we won't require any physical pumping, where we can operate with predictable ocean movement. And of course, ocean currents in many places are fairly predictable. So in terms of pumping, and generally a rule in pumping is that the larger the amount of water you want it to move, the larger the pump is. And you get pretty significant cost benefits by going to very large pumps rather than lots of small ones. So while ocean water pumping is a part of our solution and part of our energy use, it's actually not anything like the main energy use. And as I said, I do anticipate a future where we won't need to pump the water at any significant scale.
Oh, how do you get to that point?
It's first a question of making sure that our core technology works with a very low push of water through it. And if you think, of injecting water into something or injecting a liquid into something, that's what I talk about when I talk about the pressure required. We design our technology so that we don't need that pressured push of water through the system. We're in the process of piloting that technology at the moment. I can talk about our piloting campaign and what it does. And when that piloting campaign finishes, we then think we're in a position to start deploying that technology.
So let's talk a little bit more about clean energy requirements, right? At least for the technology as it's currently configured. This has been obviously a front and center issue for the carbon removal industry recently, with bison in Wyoming shutting down because of these concerns, and a number of states indicating that they may require carbon removal companies to bring their own quote unquote clean energy with them instead of drawing from the clean energy grid. Can you explain if this, at least currently, provides any major constraints in terms of where and how you would deploy this technology?
We actually see considerable opportunity in the renewable energy business. One of the challenges of direct air capture is the need for a continuous high volume of power. Again, everything we do at Captura has been designed for scale. One of the innovations that we have is that we will work both with intermittent, but also crucially with off-peak or curtailed energy. So if you recall the process that I described, our electrodialysis is our largest user of power in the system, but it's relatively capital light. And also, I only process 0.5% of the ocean water with my electrodialysis. So what we do is, in a particular location, I'll just use a hypothetical to make it easy to understand. Let's say we're operating in an environment where 6 hours a day there is excess or curtailed renewable energy. The wind is blowing, the tides are moving, the sun is shining, but there isn't the market locally. We take that excess energy, in this case 6 hours a day, we overbuild our electrodialysis by a factor of 4, and in 6 hours with 4 times the electrodialysis, we make 24 hours worth of acid and base. And then the rest of the system runs at a much, much lower power consumption rate. Now, this is actually really good news for renewable energy companies. They don't want to store or transmit over long distances excess renewable energy, nor do they want to shut down their power generation capabilities because they have to bring them back up again later. So we actually are a technology of interest to the renewable energy sector for this reason. And it's noticeable that 3 of our investors are the national renewable energy companies of Portugal, Italy, and the United Kingdom.
So Steve, I want to come back to this point about acid and base. Some of the marine carbon dioxide removal approaches have a considerable disadvantage because they produce a hydrochloride as a byproduct that then needs to be disposed of. You specifically state on your website, as well as in your description of the process just now, that you both use the acid and the base, and that you actually do not produce, or you actually do not have any byproducts. Can you say a little bit more about that and how that is true? If we can really truly think of, a pure stream of water coming in, and a stream of water going out, and there's nothing that's produced that we don't actually want.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to the philosophy of the company first, which is if you're going to do this at billion-ton scale, you can't use a lot of input material, and you also can't generate a lot of waste material. That was a fundamental philosophical point in the company's founding. So our process is entirely closed loop. We only produce acid and base for 0.5% of the ocean water that comes in. And the acid and base is 100% utilized in the cycle of removing CO2 from the ocean as it comes through the plant. There is no residual acid or base left at the end of the process. And what comes out of the back of the plant is CO2. And there will be some air mixed with that, but it's pretty straightforward to take the air out of a stream and just end up with CO2. And then ocean water that is compatible with existing standards, wastewater standards, pH levels, soluble solids, oxygen levels, all those good things. So yeah, there is no net usage of material in our system. We actually even use some of the chemicals that we produce, the sodium hydroxide and the hydrochloric acid, to clean our membranes as we proceed along. So I don't even need third-party material to maintain the plant as time progresses. It's a wholly closed-loop system.
I just wanted to ask you a follow-up in terms of the CO2 disposal question. Assuming that there's not adequate demand for utilization and storage is required, does that limit where these facilities can be sited, right? Because now you have to map storage within, 50 miles or less of where your facility is. Will that create a major constraint in terms of large scale deployment of this approach?
I mean, it's certainly a constraint. Whether it turns out to be a major constraint is to be determined. I think we will see, if the world is serious about net zero, we will see quite a widespread sequestration industry with CO2 pipelines, hubs of removal, saline aquifer storage, geological storage. I'm sure there'll be other ideas that come out for storing CO2. So we see that as an industry that will develop and a technology that will grow and expand. So Yeah, in the near term, it is a constraint because we're not yet at the point where across the globe we have multiple proven sequestration sites. Class sits well, for example, in the US. But that's got to happen if we're going to get to net zero. We have to capture all that CO2 coming out of chemical plants, and the point source industry is going to grow. The direct air capture industry will grow because that's also a good solution for carbon removal. So we expect to be able to piggyback on that over time as that industry develops.
Okay, great. So Captura has recently expanded its RD&D efforts in Los Angeles, and it's relocated a deployment site to Hawaii. Could you elaborate on the objectives and expected outcomes of these initiatives in these respective venues?
Sure. So let me first start by saying that we made a deliberate decision inside Captura to raise enough funding to take us through all of the technology development to the point of being ready for deployment, which gave us the opportunity to work extensively in the R&D sectors. And we have actually 3 pilots. We started with 1 ton, we went to 100 tons, and then the one in Hawaii will be 1,000 tons. What we basically want to do or have achieved by the end of our piloting campaign is each of the key pieces of technology in our system. We have a series of KPIs, key performance indicators, that we know we have to achieve to hit the cost points that is in our techno-economic analysis, our TEA. And to achieve those, we have these KPIs. So we measure achievement of the KPIs through each of the pilots. And then the second element is we also want to develop our modular unit, the unit that we replicate to achieve scale. I talked earlier on about how pumping is actually best achieved by physical scale. The larger the pump, the lower cost per volume of water moved. But also, of course, you get benefits by having a modular solution. So our piloting campaign will finish with proving our technology at the performance equal to our TEA, and also at the modular size that is then ready for replication and deployment. So that's the R&D initiative behind what we do in Hawaii and also Los Angeles. The second equally important point is we want to prove that there is no impact on the ocean with what we're doing, that we are safe for marine life, and that we meet wastewater standards, that you can measure the CO2 coming out of the back. So that's the second objective of our piloting campaign. One more objective of the piloting campaign, prove to people that the solution is perfectly viable and is already operating. That matters to policymakers. There's always a big chicken and egg associated with bringing in new technology to the market. People need to see that it works before wanting to fund it. But of course, you need the funds to prove that it works. So that's the summary of our piloting campaign.
Thanks. Do you have a sense of what you're hoping to get to in terms of cost per ton in the pilot phase?
Oh, pilot phase, totally irrelevant. I don't care. The piloting campaign is entirely focused on those objectives that I described. Prove the technology at the replicable scale. There is no trace whatsoever from that technology through to what the cost of a per ton would be in a large scale system. We agree with the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy has set a target of $100 per ton for carbon dioxide removal. Everything that we're doing inside Captura is designed to give us the best possible chance of hitting that point, but also at a global scale. There's no value, I think, in hitting that cost point if your capacity to scale is limited. So we aim to demonstrate our scalability, but also combine that with a very competitive and compelling cost point.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a little unfair, but do you have at least preliminary thoughts on why you think you can hit $100 per ton cost point if that's the gold standard?
No, we have way more than preliminary thoughts. I mentioned earlier on that we're in the top 20 finalists for the X Prize. That is an extremely detailed process. We have to produce very, very accurate, highly detailed, multi-thousand line TEA's, techno-economic analysis. They are reviewed by a third-party independent company that's an expert in costing. So we have gone through that process with the X Prize to a very, very thorough degree. So we think of it in two or three ways. First of all, the inherent advantage of using the ocean. It's already there. I don't have to build something or have land area that touches a lot of air. Ocean already does that for me. Second, no absorbance. I have no supply chain constraints once the plant is built. It just keeps operating. Thirdly, no byproducts to get rid of. So I save money there. Fourthly, this ability to utilize off-peak energy means that the vast majority of my energy use can be when nobody else wants that energy, where it's very cheap and sometimes even free because you're saving cost at the renewable energy company. Next, electrodialysis we think is about as good a way of producing acid and base that you can achieve. We're right next to the thermodynamic limit. So we think that's highly cost effective. And then lastly, there is no rare earth elements or complex construction in the capital phase of our plants. So we expect to be able to build these plants in a modular fashion, scale them out and deploy them pretty straightforwardly. So all of those reasons come together to produce a very, very detailed TEA that we use when we talk to customers and things like the X Prize.
Okay, that's really helpful to understand the intricate challenges and opportunities of your approach. I wonder, in this quest to scalability, how you're thinking about research questions that you still have to answer. So the marine carbon dioxide removal approaches are obviously still in R&D phases. They have a lot of oceanographic questions to answer. And I'd be curious, on your path to scalability, on your path to proving your efficiency, what those are that you're currently focusing on.
Yeah, I think obviously it's a great question. The first thing I would say is there is inherently a resistance to the idea of using the ocean. When I first looked at Captura and was approached about the job, I talked to a third party who's knowledgeable about oceans, and they told me, and I won't use their exact language for obvious reasons, but they said, we've already messed up the atmosphere. Let's not mess up the oceans too. And so a fundamental question that I had coming into the company was, is what we're doing affecting the ocean in any way? The ocean's already been badly affected by CO2 emissions. Are we making this problem worse? Or are we embarking down a path where we are uncertain of the outcome? We add nothing to the ocean. The only thing we do is we take out the CO2, which of course the atmosphere then puts back. So as long as we can be confident that our outflow doesn't harm marine life, and the approach we take on that is to be compatible with existing standards, then we feel that direct ocean capture is for want of a better expression, a cleaner way of doing marine CDR. We have, as part of the work that we've done, we've briefed about 30 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, including all of the environmental groups. The first reaction is always the same when we come in. It's, marine CDR sounds scary. But then when we talk about it and we explain our process, by the end of the discussion, they're way more comfortable. So I don't want to downplay this. There is a public perception, which is natural, that messing with the oceans is a scary thought. It's on us to demonstrate that it's not scary in the case of our process and direct ocean capture. And that's what the focus is.
Okay, so this is also a natural transition to, of course, talking about monitoring, reporting, and verification of your approach. So, as you say, making sure that you do no harm to the ocean. I do want to be a bit of the devil's advocate again, and ask, you do have to prove and show that the in this case, storage of CO2 underwater, underground is also not harmful, right? So there is also that side of the equation that you have to show. I wonder what your thinking is around that, and how you also think about public perception on that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could talk to anybody in the direct air capture industry or the energy sector, and they will tell you that that is a very manageable problem. You don't put CO2 underground just anywhere. You put it in locations that are permitted, that have been researched, that are geologically stable, and that can enable multi-thousand-year permanent storage. And that's what that industry is doing. That's what the point source capture industry is doing. I believe I'm correct in saying this. There has never been any form of safety issue related to man-made CO2 sequestration. We've never had a safety incident in that sector. And of course, we've been putting CO2 underground under the guise of enhanced oil recovery for many, many years without leakage, without significant issues. So again, we're not a sequestration company. In Captura, we take CO2 out of the ocean water. The sequestration industry will develop. It will be regulated. It will be subject to significant safety and monitoring. Yeah, and that's great. We're fully supportive of that. But I think it's fundamentally a pretty safe thing to do in the right locations. I wouldn't do it in coastal California. I wouldn't do it in earthquake zones. But the industry knows that.
Let me follow up a bit on that, though, Steve. I know you're not a sequestration company, right? But ultimately, the viability of this approach lives and dies by the ability to store CO2 underground, right? I think probably utilization has a role, but it's probably relatively small in comparison to sequestration. And last week, the French announced that they were scrapping the Picasso project, which was France's major efforts to store CO2, about 5 million tons in the Pyrenees. And that was largely because of public resistance, right? So there may be a disconnect, if I concede your point that sequestration is safe. There may still be a disconnect between public perceptions of safety and what the experts say. And would you concede that could still be a major choke point to sequestration, and thus a major choke point to the viability of direct air ocean capture in the long term?
Of course. There is considerable resistance to what needs to be done to achieve CDR at scale. The same questions you just raised, they're equally true for ocean alkalinity enhancement. They're equally true for kelp sinking. There are public concerns and questions about those things as well. We as an industry as a whole need to explain the benefits, be science focused on safety and how this works. And as I mentioned, I don't see that as part of a fundamental part of what Captura does. The direct air capture industry is doing that. The point source capture industry is doing that. The process of permitting sequestration sites in the United States is incredibly thorough. I think that will develop. I think the public over time needs to be educated. We need storytellers in this industry just as much as we need scientists, oceanographers, research chemists, and everything else. We need people who can explain things. Because the reality is, the downside of sequestration, or the risk of sequestration, is much lower than the risk of doing nothing about climate change. And that the best way to achieve the reversal of putting CO2 in the atmosphere is to take it out of the atmosphere and put it back underground again. So I think that market will develop. I think public understanding of it will develop. But that's on us collectively, the wider industry, to demonstrate and prove.
All right, so let's take it back to the question around MRV and quantification of the actual removal that takes place in the ocean. In Los Angeles, Steve, Captura is enhancing its monitoring, reporting, and verification program. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the approach generally that Captura takes to the ocean-based monitoring side, and what in particular you're focusing on in LA.
Sure. Let me first start with a philosophical point. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a regular guy, not an academic. Fundamentally, carbon emissions from fossil fuel use have damaged the atmosphere and they've damaged the ocean. That is very well understood by everybody. Our process physically removes CO2, measures it, and puts it back underground where it came from in the first place. Initially, that removal comes from the ocean. Then drawdown recovers all or some of that out of the atmosphere. So we benefit both the ocean and the atmosphere by removing CO2. We're reversing the fossil fuel damage by taking out of the ocean and out of the atmosphere. So my simple philosophical point is, why does the industry only care about what we took out of the atmosphere? Because the CO2 we take out of the ocean is equally good for the environment. It helps with ocean deacidification, which is a big issue for marine life and a big issue for climate and sustainability. So I have a philosophical point that I advocate for all the time, that removing CO2 from the biosphere is what matters. Whether you take out of the atmosphere or the ocean, you achieve some drawdown between the two, and maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 100%, maybe it takes 1 year, maybe it takes 3 years, maybe it takes 5. But fundamentally, you achieved an immediate benefit for the planet when you put CO2 physically back underground again. So we advocate that removal from the upper hydrosphere, shallow ocean water, is just as good and just the same as removing directly out of the atmosphere itself. And I'm really happy to see XPRIZE, for example, treats it that way. You can take CO2 out of the ocean or out of the atmosphere. It's the same. And now the Department of Energy defines a carbon dioxide removal credit as resulting from a net ton of CO2 captured from the atmosphere or the upper hydrosphere, and then securely stored as a direct result of a CDR project. So we are seeing momentum in recognizing that because of Henry's Law, because of the damage CO2 does to the ocean, that taking CO2 out and putting it back underground, out of the biosphere, is beneficial one way or another. Having said all of that, I recognize that right now, the carbon credits come solely and only for removal from the atmosphere in today's world. I think that may change, as I just described, but today. So we do extensive MRV work because that's the environment in which we're currently working. So we do very similar to what Alex described for Banu Carbon in the podcast last week. We do near-term measurements and then longer geographical spread modeling. So we work with a number of academic institutions. We're working with MIT, for example, to measure the near-field effects from our pilots. And then we're working with SQURP, Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, to look at how, for example, a 20 kiloton system off the coast of Southern California, how that would draw down CO2 from the atmosphere over time. So we are very much engaged with the academic community in looking at how the drawdown works and what time duration it occurs in. But in parallel, we make the argument very strongly that removal from the biosphere is a good thing, full stop.
Okay, so you alluded to some of the tools that you're using. Is it safe to say, or can you help me understand, your near-field monitoring, is that primarily motivated by regulatory purposes, or are you using a combination of sensing and model techniques to also quantify some of that removal, or is that largely, model-based for the far-field environment?
Yeah, so it's a combination. Firstly, the outflow from our plant is from a single location. So it's very easy for us to measure what's in that outflow. And we measure that for things like pH level, alkalinity, soluble solids, oxygen levels. And our technology is designed and is producing ocean water that is compatible with wastewater standards. So when you know what's coming out of the back of your plant is compatible with existing wastewater regulations, your need for measurement is less. Having said that, at our facility in Los Angeles, we have sensors located around the sort of the artificial inlet in which we're based that allow us to measure the same impacts or the same, sorry, I shouldn't say impacts, the same attributes at different points, different distances away from our outflow. We do extensive modeling of how our plume emerges into the ocean and how quickly it dilutes with the existing water around it. And then we do far-field monitoring far-field modeling, as I discussed earlier on, working with academic institutions that have access to either historical models that show CO2 drawdown when they've been looking at ocean acidification, for example. So it's a combination of all of those things. Knowing that your outflow is compatible, near-field sensors to demonstrate that nothing untoward happens as you move away from the plant. And then thirdly, that modeling at a wider scale to show how the plume comes out of the back of a large plant, dissipates into the wider area over time.
Yeah. So this part outside of the closed system then sounds very similar, if not equivalent, to the process of ocean alkalinity enhancement and quantification. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely some similarities between that wide-scale modeling and for OAE and what we do. We're actually working with one of the leading carbon credit verifiers at the moment to produce a first protocol for direct ocean capture, and it's that part of it is heavily based upon the same work that they've done for ocean alkalinity enhancement. I should say one other thing about our ocean health campaign that's very important. I talked about how our outflow is compatible with wastewater standards, but we have a strong focus on ocean health. So we actually provide our outflow to companies that are growing mussels within 100%, 75%, 50%, 25% concentration of our outflow to demonstrate that even in the 100% outflow case, the mussels, which are very sensitive to changes in ocean chemistry, can grow quite happily. And we also do that with a variety of stages of mussels, from, I don't know what the right word is for a baby mussel, but for young mussels all the way through to more mature mussels. We also work with the aquaculture companies to provide our outflow to them so they can assess how plant life in the ocean also responds to our outflow. So it's not just the MRV side, it's also the ocean health side, and looking at how even at 100% of our outflow, that marine life is perfectly able to adopt and thrive.
Great. Yeah. So, and that certainly is thanks to the fact that you are indeed not introducing any additional materials, etc. It is purely a decarbonized stream of water that they might even benefit from. Are there, apart from some of the benefits you even just described, or maybe I was mistaken, but could you help us understand better what perhaps some benefits are that you're looking into, as well as some risks that you are aware of?
Yeah, the fact that the carbon dioxide is taken out at a localized area gives you the opportunity potentially to assist with deacidification. Now, the problem is the ocean's really, really big. And so our outflow becomes, if you pardon the pun, a drop in the ocean. So even at large scale, it's still a drop in the ocean. So I think there is candidate opportunities to deal with localized deacidification, but only in areas where you have relatively little interaction between, say, for example, a bay and the wider ocean. Because if you have regular water exchange between the bay and the wider ocean, we're just a drop in the ocean. So I think there are benefits. We have not done detailed studies on that. Again, focus of the company is demonstrating that we do no harm and that our technology works exactly as we describe. That's our primary focus at this stage.
I have one last MRV question for the larger scale deployment potential that is perhaps also a bit philosophical. If you are pleading for the removal from the hydrosphere to be just as beneficial as from the atmosphere, how do you see the interplay and potential for I don't know if it's double counting, but the interplay with other marine CDR companies that are credited for, the intake from CO2 from the atmosphere to the ocean, and your company operating nearby and taking that CO2 out again. Can you illuminate that process a bit? I know we're very far away from that being a reality, but I think it's one of those questions that is sometimes a bit hard to comprehend and visualize.
I think there is a fundamental challenge with MRV in the CDR world, which is that this is a multivariable problem. And what we seek to do is try and limit those variables and say, therefore, the answer is X. The reality is that there are way more variables. Let me give you an example. And when I ran the direct air capture company, I was very aware of the fact that if we successfully get to net zero and are doing direct air capture, the ocean will outgas CO2 in large volumes. And as a result, direct air capture is not 100% efficient, even in the best case. But we don't take that into account in detailed models. When we look at the MRV for a single solution, we ignore, as you just pointed out, what may be going on elsewhere. I do worry that the MRV focus will result in paralysis. There are just too many variables, way too hard to prove anything, and so consequently we don't do anything. We are in a climate crisis. We need to do stuff. If our process is 90% efficient, 80% efficient, 70%, it's better than 0% efficient, which is what happens if it isn't fielded. But it's not zero. That's my point. It's zero if our company doesn't go anywhere, but it's somewhere between 100 and maybe 70 if it does. Is it critical that we figure out, is it 71, 72? Or is it more important that we move ahead? Once we know that safety concerns and ocean health concerns are addressed, I would never advocate moving ahead with deployment of an industry before you know that it's safe to do so. But does it really matter exactly what percentage of efficiency we achieve when we start? As long as it's not zero, it's a good thing.
Well, that's an interesting question, right? In the voluntary carbon markets, it matters a lot, right? Because they're buying units, they're buying pork bellies at a certain unit price, right? Does that suggest that ultimately we probably should be moving more to a public benefit sort of model, right? Which suggests moving out of the voluntary carbon markets, right? When it comes to a lot of these approaches.
Yeah.
Or the ton-based accounting, right? Like what you alluded to as well, Steve, that 70% is better than 100% efficiency. What I try to also get at, I think, and maybe I'm not able to articulate it perfectly, but it's okay if we know that some of company X's activity takes away from company Y's efficiency, as long as the net benefit is a little bit positive, right? Like that's better than doing nothing for sure. But in order to know that that is at least net beneficial, we do need to understand how some of these activities would interact with one another.
I don't disagree with you. I come back to the point again, if we use my simple scale of 0% efficiency, 70 or 100, if we're 70% efficient of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, we were 30% efficient of taking CO2 out of the ocean. We still took CO2 out of the biosphere. We still put it underground. We still got rid of it. So why we penalize 30% in my example? Because 30% of the benefit was to the ocean. That's a problem we all face as a society, the damage we've done to the ocean too. So to me, it's these things should be considered. It's a wider question, voluntary market versus regulated. I am a very, very strong believer that we need to regulate the market. That also comes down to financing. If you would go to any financier and say, "Hey, I'd like you to finance my business. My revenue is dependent on a voluntary market," that scares them, because the voluntary market implies that at any moment the volunteers could quit. A regulated market is way better. So I think the voluntary market is fantastic the likes of Frontier, Microsoft, and others have done a great job in being first adopters, but that's not the long-term solution. And the sooner we lose the language of the voluntary market and replace it with a compliance type market, or a risk addressing market, which I think has a lot of potential. Public companies are required to disclose significant risks on their balance sheets. If we had them put the climate risk onto their balance sheets at large scale, that creates a very interesting market opportunity that financiers will be happy to back. So I think moving towards a compliance regulated type market, and over time away from the voluntary market is essential. That is casting no shade on what the voluntary guys have done. This industry would not be here if it wasn't for those early adopters.
Well, that's a good segue into some of the regulatory questions. So, when EPA issued its guidance recently about how they might contemplate regulating these approaches, right? MCDR approaches, right? They made distinctions between different interventions, and I was wondering if you could explain what the federal and state regulatory environment looks like for you. What are you regulated under in terms of federal law, and what are the considerations in terms of state laws?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, very different, we think, for us compared to, for example, ocean alkalinity enhancement or solutions where you're adding material to the ocean. Again, let me reinforce, our outflow is completely compatible with existing standards. So if we're operating at a facility that already has a license to operate or regulatory approval, then including our process changes nothing.
Right. And that's clean water, and that's under the Clean Water Act, right? In the US.
Correct. Yeah. And of course, we've engaged with the relevant authorities in all the locations that we have pilots to validate that position and confirm it. So as we deploy internationally, we lead with this point that our outflow is compatible with existing wastewater standards. That makes the permitting process a lot easier. There is a frame of reference and a process already set up. Now, we look like a strange animal because we're not a desalination plant, or we're not a power plant that is outflowing cooling water back into the ocean. We're different. But once we explain that we achieve all of the criteria under the regulations, we're in a much stronger position. We talked extensively with the desalination community about this. Their view is that the permits that they have to have would allow for our operation in our process because we don't change the permit. So that's really the approach that we take. So far, that has proven to be correct and viable, valid, whatever the right word is. As we go into other jurisdictions internationally, we'll follow the same approach and see where it gets us.
Okay. So let's just circle back to this issue of public engagement. I'm curious what's the current status of public engagement for the company, and how do you view public engagement as a process?
So we've done public engagement both in LA and also in Hawaii. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had an event that we participated in Hawaii that had over 900 people from the local community there. We've done open houses in LA to explain our process. As I mentioned, we've engaged with all of the leading NGOs, environmental NGOs, including Ocean Conservancy, National Wildlife Fund, and others to explain what we do. We talk about the side benefits that can potentially accrue. We touched on one earlier on localized deacidification, the potential to assist with, for example, shellfish farming or coral reef blanching. These are things that interest people. They see that as a benefit of what we're doing. So far, so good. Again, as we talked about when we talked about sequestration, it's on the industry to have storytellers and people who can talk about all the benefits and put that in a way that the general public understands. I understood nothing about Henry's Law or the air-sea gas exchange when I joined Captura. And I'm a relatively educated member of the public in CDR. We have a huge task ahead of us to explain those things in simple terms. so that we can actually get on with doing something about climate change.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us for the hour. We could probably go on for a while. I definitely take away a couple of new insights, especially around the benefit from the biosphere removal in particular, and want to give you the chance to wrap it up and perhaps name some of the three biggest questions that keep you up at night currently.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on and giving me the opportunity to explain direct ocean capture and what Captura does, and maybe the slightly different way of thinking about things that differentiate us from the ocean alkalinity enhancement community. There's a lot of commonality, but there's also differences. I wrote these three things down when I first saw your question, and after an hour of talking with you, I think it's still the same. Number one, at the large scale, how do we convince the general public to care about climate change and to want to do something about it now? That's an immense issue, and we see it in elections around the world. We have not succeeded as an industry in convincing people that it's on us to do something about this now and make it a priority. It amazes me. People will say, I'd do anything for my kids, but they wouldn't do this. They wouldn't get on with fixing the atmosphere and the damage that we've done to it and the oceans. So that's number one, but front and center, number one. Second one, how do we get to that regulated market rather than a voluntary one? The voluntary one is scary for financiers, and we need regulation to ensure that it's a level playing field and we have common definitions for everybody. And then the last one, why do we ignore the ocean benefits when we assess what direct ocean capture can do? And why do we focus only on calculating exactly what the drawdown will be, how long it will take? And why do we care whether we're 70%, 71%, 73% efficient, when the other part of the efficiency that you don't achieve is benefiting the ocean? So those are the three biggest questions at the end of this. And again, thank you for your time. Great questions. Clearly very knowledgeable in what you do. It's been a fun discussion.
Thank you so much, Steve. And yeah, I'm definitely taking, especially the latest part, with me to think about. I'm gonna probably reach out to you again. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for listening, and share our podcast widely if you liked it. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.